Alright guys, welcome back to another wonderful day of art. Today we're going to be creating a watercolor technique sheet. Now, we've been working on our skills and building up our skills of using watercolor. We've worked on trying to figure out how to make gradients, how to control colors, mix colors, so on and so forth. And today we are going to look at some techniques to kind of bring some interesting elements to our own work. So, there are 10 different techniques that we're going to work on. As you can imagine, there are a lot more than this, but these are the 10 that we're going to focus on for this particular unit. So, before we get started, we are going to have to prep our piece of paper so that we can break it up into 10 different sections. Again, we're going to be working on 10 different techniques, and so we need specific areas so we know which technique is which. So, everybody is going to get a large piece of watercolor paper. It's going to be nice and blank, so you have a nice blank canvas. And what we're going to need to do is we need to break it up into 10 different sections. So everybody's going to take some tape, and with this tape, remember that you must de-stick your tape anytime that you stick it to a piece of paper, because if you do not do this, then it's going to rip. Okay, so the first mark that I'm going to make is going to be about that long. Remember that you have to stick the tape to your clothing in order to de-stick the tape before you stick it to the paper. Now remember, you want to stick it to your clothing a couple of times, right? Not just once or twice, but let's say 4 or 5 times, making sure that the tape is not too sticky where it's going to rip the page, but just sticky enough where it'll stick and block out specific colors. So when doing this, again, you need to just break it up into 10 different sections. It doesn't need to necessarily be perfect. As you see here, I kind of went across this way, went across here, stopped here, went across here and here. As you can imagine, the more unique the better. But again, just as long as you have 10 different sections, you are good to go. So I'm going to make my first stick here. Again, no rhyme, no reason, nothing specific. Just again, you need to build up 10 different sections. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to speed it up. We'll be right back. Now we're broken up into 10 different sections. In here, you want to make sure that you rub down your tape and make sure that it's nice and stuck to all of your sections. Okay? The tape is going to block out any watercolor from getting to the next section, and if it's not stuck down nice and tight, then of course, as you can imagine, it's going to start to bleed in into each of the sections. So now it's time to get started creating our technique sheet. So as I mentioned, we're going to be doing 10 different techniques, and we're going to start at the top with flat wash. So with flat wash, our goal is to just take one of our sections and go ahead and just have a flat color. Now, that may seem easy, but of course, with watercolor and with the paint that you're grabbing, it is definitely going to kind of want to go all over the place. So to be successful at this, first you're going to pick any square that you want. I think I'm going to do the smaller square. And you're going to take your palette. You're going to wet your brush with some clean water, and then you're going to go ahead and you're just going to grab some paint. Now here, you're going to kind of just fill your brush on both sides, and when you're painting with flat wash, you want to do them in like one direction, one swipe. Now the goal here is to be as even as possible, and so you might have to go back and forth between grabbing more and more water, because remember that your paper is dry, so it's going to start absorbing all of that water and that paint. So you might have to go back a couple of times, but in order to be successful at flat wash, you want to kind of start from one side and just have a continuous stroke from left to right. This is going to help make sure that the color is nice and even, and that it doesn't pull up in one area or the other. Now, as you guys have learned so far, that if you have too much water in one spot, it starts to pool up and then it kind of gets really hard to control. So here, we don't want to put too much water, and we want to make sure that we're just going in one direction even color all the way through. Alright guys, next up we're going to do a gradient wash. So when we do a gradient wash, our goal is to take one color and then transition from that color to just clean water. So here at the end you'll see that there's going to be just a little bit of the color still there, but again your goal is to have more water on this side than color, and then on here more color than water. So to do so, remind yourself that you always want to make sure that again you wash your brush in the dirty cup first, and then of course wash it one more time in the clean cup so that you don't have any color left over from the dirty cup. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and work in this box, and I am going to just think about which direction I want to work in. So I think I'm going to go from color at the top, and we're going to transition to that transparent color at the bottom, as I mentioned. So I'm going to do the same color. I'm going to work with green. And so I'm going to dip in. I'm going to wet my brush with clean water, and I'm just going to grab some green, and then I'm just going to kind of start from the top. So here, what I found to be successful to do a gradient wash is to kind of start and then just gradually just keep going. So you'll notice that as it goes, you start to run out of color, and it just kind of starts to fade into transparent or white. So to make sure that the gradient is blended kind of perfectly, I go back in, clean my brush off, dirty water first, clean water next, and then I take this clean brush, kind of semi-wet, just not too much, and then I kind of just do it again, right? Just to make sure that the values are all blended together. And then at a point, it's going to run out of water, so you can kind of just dip it back into that clean water, and then just continue this gradient. Now, here towards the end, I'm just adding just clean water with no color. So, and I'm hoping that this color here will start to kind of bleed into this kind of cleaner area. And voila. So now I want to have just a little bit more color up here and kind of do it again. So what I'll do the same exact kind of method that I just did. And now this time the whole area is kind of saturated with water. And naturally you kind of just see it start to fade into the more transparent color. So here, voila. You want to control to make sure again that the color that's loaded up here eventually fades into a nice clear transparent color. So you should only be able to see just a little bit of the green, and then the actual true value of the green up here. Okay guys, next up we have wet on wet. So exactly as it sounds, we're going to take one of these sections and we're going to wet it first. Once it's all wet, then we're going to go ahead and apply color. So just like I've been telling you, take your brush, clean your brush, dirty cup first, clean cup next, and then you're just going to go ahead and paint this section with no color, just water. Okay. So you want to make sure that the whole area is nice and coated with water. You don't want it to be too saturated, but you also want to have enough so that water is clearly there. Okay, so once I get water in all of the sections, I am then going to go ahead and take my first color. So let's say I'm going to dip into red, and I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of just touch any area. You'll see that the water color kind of just disperses and goes kind of literally wherever it wants. So with that process, I'm going to continue that with just multiple colors. So again, you'll just kind of just touch. Sometimes you might want to experiment just grabbing more water, or excuse me, more color. Here, maybe take some green. Right, just watch it kind of disperse and just go wherever it wants. I put some green over there. Now, as you're doing this process, I want you to experiment with kind of what it's like when you add a lot of color, a little bit of color, right? Like, can you put it next to a color and see how it kind of bleeds in and transitions with the colors that are already there? Right? What happens when you take a lighter color like yellow? And so, really just experiment with what's happening here. Now, there's going to be some sections that might dry up a little bit, so you got to be very cautious on when you add more water, not to kind of disrupt what's happening. But continue. So your goal here is to kind of fill the entire space with something. So try different techniques by, again, just kind of dropping color into the area. Maybe you can take some color and then just like paint it into the area, see what happens. Kind of do a mixture of both, right? Paint and drop. Don't hesitate to go back into another section and add more color and see what happens. And again, this is all experimentation, just trying to figure out how this works and kind of learning new techniques as you go. So as you're working on this, maybe kind of intentionally going up next to a color, see how it's going to blend and mix together. Now, when we do wet on wet, this sometimes turns into just a little bit of danger because you get something going and it's looking really nice and really cool, but then of course the waters still tend to kind of just bleed and still move, and before you know it, you have a lot of color that just kind of pulls up into the corners. And so if that does happen, don't be afraid to stop, right? Let it dry, or you can go ahead and take a paper towel and kind of dab up some of that water, or you can just dry your brush off, and once it's dry, you can kind of go in and just kind of touch the areas that have too much water, and then it'll kind of soak up into the brush, and that'll help control and force the colors to not move around as much. But with this here, I want you guys to fill the entire area with some color. So this method, wet on wet, is really good for if you're trying to recreate, let's say, some water, or if you're trying to create the sky or some clouds. Or honestly, it's just a really good kind of effect to add maybe in a background. Again, kind of the options are yours. So as you're doing this, just be very cautious. When colors mix together, remember that when they all kind of just meet each other, they just turn brown. So remember, talking about control, we have to figure out how we're going to control this so it doesn't get too out of hand too fast. So as you're working, make sure that you're, going slow with your water, not adding too much, but adding just enough for the paint to kind of take its shape and form and do its thing. But also making sure that you're observing if things get out of hand, that you're there to kind of stop and prevent it from bleeding into one another. So voila, wet on wet. Alright guys, next up is going to be edge blurring. So this technique is used when you are trying to kind of blend things together, or kind of just not have any hard edges on your work. Some people might like the hard edges. It's kind of up to you. But again, we want to just kind of experience all different techniques so that when we are creating work of our own, we have full control of what the outcome is going to be. So I've been using my flat brush, and I've been using the bigger flat brush just to cover more area. But for the edge blurring, I'm going to transition, and I'm going to use one of my rounds. Now, between the two, you can use the big one, but I think I'm going to prefer the smaller one so I can get some details. Now, nonetheless, with all of these different techniques, you're more than welcome, of course, to use any brush that you'd like. Again, I gave you 4 for a reason, so that you have versatility, and every single person is going to be a little bit different. So, again, If you choose to use a big brush or the same brush for every single technique, that's up to you. It's just like when we use pencils. Some people prefer an old school wood pencil where you sharpen it. Some people love lead pencils. Some people prefer .7 lead. I prefer .5 lead. Again, they all do the same job. It's just what you feel comfortable with. So again, number 4, edge blurring. So the first thing that you're going to do is, of course, pick what square you want to work in. So I'm going to work on this one down over here. And in this square, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a color, and let's say, I forgot to show you guys what it looks like. So we're going to create edge blurring, which looks like this. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to grab a color, and we're going to paint, and we're just going to kind of create these random lines with our marks. And then we're going to take our brush and we're just going to blur the edges so they kind of fade into each other. So again, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take your color. So in this case, I'm going to use violet, and then you're just going to kind of just paint marks. And your lines, they don't have to be curved like mine. They can be nice and straight. They could be just unison. Again, kind of up to you. Now, I have too much violet up here, so I'm just going to, instead of dipping into the palette, I'm just going to borrow it and continue. Just a little bit more from the palette. Here. Voila. So once you have all of these kind of established, you then are going to wash your brush and then kind of clean it in the clean cup. And then with every edge, you're going to take your brush and you're going to kind of just blur them so that they nicely transition and fade in to the section above. So here, you've got to be very cautious of how much water you're grabbing, because then it'll start to pull up and then it'll all just get kind of messy. So notice how I did not go to grab more water, because this, what I had already on there, was more than enough. So as you're working on this, your goal is to blur the edges. And by doing that, you're rubbing your brush up against the paint that is already there. And you're taking that edge and you're kind of blending it together to kind of fade into the section that's right above it. I'm getting some more water. With a clean brush, I go and kind of just do the same thing again. And so you'll repeat this process, just kind of blurring the edges for every one of these sections. Alright guys, and voila, we have edge blurring. So now with edge blurring, as you can imagine, it takes some time to kind of get used to, but the goal here again is to kind of, so you don't have such a hard line. So these, they're still kind of hard, so I can spend a lot of time just going back and forth and blending them out. But again, the goal and the intent around here is to kind of smooth out the edges so they're not so dark and there. Sometimes we're looking for just for a nice blend. Alright guys, so next up we're going to be working on layering. So exactly as it sounds, we are going to practice and kind of experience what it's like to layer up colors. So the first thing that we're going to do, again, we're going to pick any square that we want, and I think I'm going to go ahead and do it here. Our goal is to paint one set of shapes or lines, whatever it might be, and then we're going to let those dry, and then we're going to paint over them so that we can see what it looks like when we layer things on top of one another. So the first thing you're going to do is, of course, you're going to grab your color palette, and then you're going to dip into any color that you want to use initially. So for this one, I don't think I'm going to mix the colors because we have a whole journey of doing that. And for our technical example, we can go ahead and just do straight up colors. So step one for this layering exercise, or this technique, we are going to go ahead and again, we're just going to paint some shapes. So what I'm going to ask you to do is again, paint some shapes and then just fill up the entire space. And so after you're done painting the shapes, I'll let you know what to do next. But I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video so that we can get these shapes painted. So do make sure that when you're painting your shapes that you do not overlap in this first go. And then just kind of fill up the entire space, leaving space between each shape. And now that everything is dry, we can go back in and go ahead and paint our next layer of shapes. So when we work on this section, and when we go back in when it's dry, I want to intentionally layer colors up on top of each other. So here, again, you're just going to dip into your palette, get some color. Then I want you guys to, again, just go for it. Right? Make sure that you are, again, intentionally layering up on top of what's already there. Now this skill here can bring some dimension to your work, can bring, of course, layers in different levels, and so depending on what you're creating, this can be a really good effect for you when you're painting your own project. So again, as you're doing this, just kind of explore and again, intentionally layer on top of one another. And there we have it, layering. So again, kind of just observe how when you layer something on top of one another that, you know, so the colors don't necessarily go away, they kind of peek and shine through. And so as you're working and as you're creating, think about how this can kind of elevate your work or take it to that next level.